trip was a reunion, perhaps the last. Maria, Anna, John, Lucas and Pedro had known each other since childhood, but time had changed them all. Each one followed different paths. Maria was a teacher in a small town. Anna worked as a nurse. João was about to move to another country. Lucas had recently ended a troubled relationship, and Pedro was immersed in an endless work routine. So they decided to spend one last weekend together, as they had done when they were younger. There was something fascinating about the forest they had chosen for the camp. Isolated, wild, and practically untouched, it was far from the popular trails. "It's the perfect place to relax," John said, as they parked the car on the dirt road that would take them to the entrance of the forest. But as soon as they entered the narrow trails, something seemed off. The air was heavy, and an unusual silence dominated the environment. Even the birds seemed to avoid that place. "Have you heard about the legends of this forest?" Pedro asked with a mocking smile. He liked to feed discomfort. "They say some people have disappeared here." "Oh, sure, Pedro," Anna laughed, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. "There's always a story like that. They want to scare the tourists." After hours of walking, they finally found a clearing that was perfect for camping. They set up their tents, lit a fire, and spent the early evening talking and reminiscing about their childhood. The initial tension seemed to have dissipated, replaced by laughter and the warmth of friendship. It was as if they were together again, just like before. However, as soon as the silence of the night enveloped them, the wind began to blow through the trees in a strange way, carrying an almost imperceptible sound. Distant whispers seemed to mix with the wind, creating an unsettling sensation. John was the first to notice, frowning and trying to focus on the sound. "Did you hear that?" he asked, but the others ignored it. "It must just be the wind," Maria said, a little suspiciously, trying not to feed the discomfort. After all, they were there to relax, not to feed superstitions. However, that night would only be the beginning of something much more disturbing. The next morning brought sunlight, and with it the tranquility of a new day. The group woke up early with renewed energy, ready to explore the forest further. The previous night, with its strange whispers, was soon forgotten amidst the jokes and excitement of the adventure. Lucas, however, seemed quieter than usual, something that Maria noticed but decided not to comment on. Perhaps it was just the effect of tiredness. Throughout the day, they walked along unfamiliar trails, talked about the past, and even joked about who would get lost first in the dense forest. The discomfort with the forest seemed to have completely disappeared. But as the sun began to set, the familiar feeling of unease returned. The air seemed dense again, and the shadows of the trees grew around them, as if they were closing in on each other in a suffocating embrace. When they returned to camp, with darkness already taking over the clearing, they prepared dinner in silence. The excitement of the morning had disappeared, replaced by a tiredness that everyone felt but could not explain. It wasn't long before they retreated to their tents, hoping the night would pass quickly. But at some point during the early hours of the morning, Lucas woke up suddenly, his heart racing. His eyes flew open, but he couldn't say what had woken him. Everything was quiet, except for the soft sound of the wind passing through the trees. Or was there something else? "Lucas," he sat up immediately, his heart racing even more. He had heard his name clearly, a whisper coming from outside the tent. He fell silent, trying to convince himself that he was dreaming. But then he heard it again. "Lucas, come!" It was impossible to ignore it now. Trembling, he left the tent, expecting to find someone outside. But there was no one. The camp was deserted and quiet, except for the sound of the wind. Looking around, the shadows of the trees seemed deeper and more menacing than before. "Maria?" Lucas called out, hoping that one of his friends was playing a prank, but all he got in response was silence. The next day, Lucas told what he had heard, clearly shaken. It was so real. It was a woman's voice, whispering my name. He looked around, hoping someone would believe him. "Maybe it was just a dream," Anna said, trying not to show her discomfort. "A dream that happened outside the tent," Pedro teased, but unlike the night before, no one laughed. When night fell again, the whispers returned. This time everyone heard them, but they were still faint, mixed with the sound of the wind. Each of them heard their own name, whispered by voices that seemed to come from all sides of the forest. Now the discomfort could no longer be ignored. "What the hell is going on here?" John asked, his voice low, as everyone looked nervously into the darkness around them. No one had an answer. The tension in the camp was palpable. Each of them knew something was wrong, but no one had the courage to speak about the growing fear. That night, the silence between them was deeper than that of the surrounding trees. Even the conversations before the campfire had ceased, as if the environment itself was suffocating them. The laughter and jokes from the beginning of the trip seemed to belong to a distant past. As the wind blew again, the whispers returned, clearer than before. This time, they were not just calling their names. The voices, low and disturbing, began to say things they had never revealed to anyone. Anna was the first to react, her expression frozen in shock. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice shaking. No one understood what she meant at first, but when they heard the whispers again, the situation became clear. The voice, distant and at the same time close, said something that only Anna could know. That night, the abortion. She recoiled, almost as if she had been physically struck. "Did you hear that?" His voice was a desperate whisper. How could anyone know? John frowned, but before he could answer, he heard his own secret being revealed. The betrayal, the money. He froze, feeling the blood drain from his face. Years ago he had betrayed a friend, accepting money to sabotage a project, something he had kept buried deep in his mind. Now the secret hung in the air, exposed for all to hear like an open wound. Pedro, who had been trying to remain skeptical until then, turned abruptly to the group. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" He looked directly at Maria, as if expecting her to be manipulating the situation. But the fear in her eyes was real, as was his. "Who else knows this?" The whispers continued, revealing pieces of each of them, unearthing the darkest parts of their lives, the ones they never imagined anyone could know. Each revelation was like a blade cutting through the little trust that remained between them. The forest seemed to be playing with their deepest fears. "I want to get out of here," Anna said, her voice shaking. "Now!" That night they tried to grab flashlights and follow the path back. But as they walked along the trail, something strange began to happen. The trees seemed to shift, the path they knew so well becoming increasingly confusing. They were walking in circles, but neither of them could understand how. The forest seemed alive, playing with their minds. "This doesn't make sense," Pedro shouted, frustration starting to boil over. "We're on the right path, I'm sure of it." "There's something surrounding us," Lucas muttered, looking around uneasily. He was right. The whispers were now coming from every direction, and the forest, once silent and peaceful, seemed to have an oppressive presence around them, closing in like an invisible trap. Fear was growing inside them. It wasn't just the fact that they were lost. It was as if the forest was playing with them, unearthing their fears and secrets, forcing them to confront truths they would rather forget. "We need to go back to camp," Maria said, her voice firm despite her growing fear. "Walking around here won't help us." Reluctantly, they agreed. But the way back seemed as disconcerting as the way out. And when they finally came into sight of the tents, their sense of relief was minimal. The air around them was thick with tension, and no one dared to say what they really felt, that they were at the mercy of something they could not control. That night was worse than the previous ones. The darkness seemed thicker, the silence more disturbing. No one could sleep properly, and whispers became a constant presence around the camp. It was impossible to escape the sound, which now seemed to come from within them. Each one heard different voices, revealing pieces of their lives that they preferred to keep buried. Lucas was the most affected. From the moment he heard his name whispered, he seemed distant, lost in dark thoughts. He barely spoke during dinner, and before retiring he spent a long time observing the forest, as if he were waiting for something. His eyes were sunken and lost, and Maria, who knew him better than the others, noticed the change, but no one commented. In the middle of the night, when the wind began to blow stronger, the group was awakened by an even more disturbing sound: Lucas's absence. Pedro was the first to notice. He left the tent in silence, feeling his heart racing, and found Lucas's tent empty, his sleeping bag turned upside down, as if he had left in a hurry. "Lucas," Pedro called, his voice breaking the silence of the early morning. No answer. The camp was too quiet, except for the faint rustling of the leaves around them. Maria left soon after, feeling the panic rising. "He wasn't well," she said, looking around, trying to control her fear. "I shouldn't have gone out alone." The group quickly gathered, flashlights in hand, and decided to search for Lucas in the forest. But as soon as they started walking, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent, calling their names and throwing secrets into the air, like invisible knives cutting the trust between them. They walked for an hour, maybe more, and just as they were about to give up, Pedro spotted something between the trees. It was Lucas. He was standing, still in the middle of the trail, his eyes open but fixed on a distant point. His face was pale, and he was mumbling something, but the words were incomprehensible. "Lucas!" John shouted, running to him. When she reached him, she shook him by the shoulders, trying to bring him back to reality. "What are you doing? What happened?" Lucas didn't answer. His lips moved slowly, but the sound that came out was an indistinct murmur, almost like an echo of the whispers they heard in the forest. He seemed to be in a trance, as if the forest itself had taken him over. "He's not okay," Anna murmured, looking around, trying to understand what was happening. "There's something controlling him." Desperately, they took him back to camp. Lucas didn't resist, but he didn't cooperate either. He simply followed, lost in his own world, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, as if he were seeing something the others couldn't. The group was shaken. Lucas, who until then had been the most focused among them, was now lost in a strange stupor, mumbling things that no one could understand. The atmosphere around the camp was suffocating, as if the forest was watching them, waiting for their next move. Maria, Anna, John, and Pedro knew that something had to be done, but fear paralyzed them. "We can't go on like this," said Maria, staring at Lucas, who remained seated next to the fire, completely oblivious to her presence. "We need to get out of here, and fast." "But what about Lucas?" asked Anna, worried. "We can't leave him like this." "We won't let him," replied Pedro, trying to sound confident, although his tone betrayed his growing fear. "We have to find a way out before we all end up like him." They decided to explore the surroundings of the camp once more, this time with Lucas being carried in case he couldn't walk on his own. The forest, however, seemed like an endless maze. The further they walked, the more the scenery repeated itself, as if they were trapped in an endless cycle. After hours of wandering aimlessly, they finally reached a different place, a clearing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by gigantic ancient trees. In the center, there were stones arranged in a circle, covered in moss but still visible. Something about the symbols engraved on the stones seemed ancient, almost primitive. "What is this?" John murmured, approaching cautiously. Pedro bent down to take a closer look. The symbols were strange, geometric shapes and markings he had never seen before. "This looks like some kind of ritual," he said, his voice low. Maria felt a shiver run down her spine. The stones were worn with age, but there was something about their arrangement that conveyed a sense of dark power. "We shouldn't be here," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the circle. Lucas, who had been inert until then, suddenly stood up and walked toward the center of the stone circle. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical. His friends tried to hold him back, but he seemed to be in a trance, driven by an invisible force. "Lucas, stop!" Anna shouted, but he didn't respond. When Lucas reached the center, the whispers started again, louder than ever. This time they came directly from the stones, echoing through the clearing. The voices whispered in an unknown language, but the sense of dread they conveyed was clear. Maria tried to back away, but something kept her rooted to the spot. This is some kind of ancient ritual," she whispered, looking around. "These symbols, they're trapping us here." It was then that they realized the truth. The forest was the scene of ancient rituals, performed by people who believed that human sacrifice could keep their souls trapped among the living. The whispers were the voices of the victims of these rituals, condemned to wander the forest, and now their friends were the new chosen ones. The clearing seemed to breathe with them, growing more oppressive, as if the forest itself was waiting for a decision. The silence after the whispers was heavy, like an invisible presence, forcing them to deal with what they knew was inevitable. Lucas stood in the center of the circle, his eyes blank, lost in a trance that the others could not break. He mumbled something that none of them could understand, as if he were communicating with the stones, with the forest itself. "We have to do something," Anna whispered, her words barely audible. The panic in her voice was unmistakable. John looked around, desperately trying to find a solution. "What can we do, Anna? We are lost here." Pedro, further away, was breathing heavily, his fear turning into something darker. "We already know what the forest wants. They said it. They want a sacrifice. That is why we are trapped." Maria stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "What are you saying, Pedro?" "It's the only way!" Peter exploded, his voice almost hysterical. "Look at Lucas! He's already gone! We have no choice!" "No!" Mary screamed, refusing to accept it. "He's our friend. We're not going to abandon him." "Friend?" Pedro laughed, but it was a bitter, desperate laugh. "That doesn't matter anymore. The forest will kill us if we don't do something. They want one of us. If it's not him, it'll be any of us." His eyes swept the group, but landed on Lucas, who remained motionless. Anna looked at Lucas, tears in her eyes. He's trapped. We can't just... But Pedro wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the center of the circle, as if the decision had already been made. The silence around them seemed to wait, pressing them with an impossible choice. Time was running out, and they knew it. If we don't do this, we'll all die, Pedro said, his voice lower now, more controlled, but still filled with terror. He took a step toward Lucas. Maria rushed to stand between Pedro and Lucas, raising her hands in supplication. Pedro, please! This can't be the only way out. Let's think of another solution, please. Pedro hesitated, but the panic on his face was visible. Do you think there's another solution, Maria? Do you think this forest will let us leave without taking one of us? The desperation in the group grew, and Anna began to cry silently. We can't do this. Pedro, now with tears in his eyes, held a branch, looking at Lucas with determination written all over his face. If we don't do this, we'll die here. In an irrational impulse, Pedro advanced. But before he could hit Lucas, John grabbed him tightly, knocking the branch to the ground. They both fell next to the rocks, the sound of the impact echoing in the clearing. Pedro, now in tears, murmured, I just wanted to save us all. The forest watched quietly, as if considering the choice. The silence that followed the fight was even more disturbing than the whispers. Pedro, panting, remained on the ground, his hands shaking, while John walked away, catching his breath. The group seemed stuck in a state of shock, all absorbing what had almost happened. Lucas still stood motionless in the center of the stone circle, his murmurs now barely audible. It was Maria who broke the silence first. We have to get out of here, now! Anna, who was still crying silently, nodded without saying a word. John helped Pedro to his feet, the two exchanging a heavy look, full of understanding and fear. Despite everything Pedro had done or almost done, neither of them could entirely blame him. The fear that the forest had instilled in them all was too deep. With Lucas still in a trance, Maria grabbed his arm, trying to bring him back. Come on, Lucas, please. But he remained distant, as if his connection to the world around him had been broken. Still, they took him with them, keeping him by their side as they tried to find their way back out of the forest. This time the forest felt different. The trees, which had once seemed alive and threatening, were now quieter. The circle of stones quickly disappeared behind them, as if it had never been there. The path that had once seemed distorted and endless finally opened up before them, and for the first time in days, they felt that perhaps there was a way out. The walk back was silent and tense, with only the sounds of muffled footsteps and the controlled breathing of the group breaking the stillness. The whispering voices that had previously haunted them had disappeared, yet terror still hung in the air. The forest might be letting them go. But something in the back of each of their minds told them that the experience would never truly leave them. When they finally saw the dirt road where they had left their car, relief mixed with fear washed over them. They were back in the real world, but they knew that something had changed forever. Lucas, still trapped in his catatonia, was placed in the back seat while Maria, Anna, John, and Pedro settled into the car in silence. The engine roared, and they left the forest behind. No one dared to look back. The drive back to the city was filled with the same unsettling silence. Even after they left the forest, what had happened inside clung to them. It was a shadow they could not escape, no matter how much they tried. At the end of the road, when the city was already visible in the distance, Maria looked at Lucas, expecting to see some sign of improvement, but instead she heard something that made her freeze. A soft whisper, almost inaudible, echoed through the car. Maria. She looked ahead, her heart racing again. The whispers had not ended. Even far from the forest, they were still with them, and perhaps they always would be.